Hey everybody, it's Norm from Tested.
And Frank from Tested.
We're back at Frank's shop this week to work on a casting project.
Yes.
But we're casting up something that you didn't sculpt or create the mold of.
Nope. This was brand new. My buddy Steve Johnson came by and said, "Hey, I want to make these Slimers to sell at Monsterpalooza. Can you cast them up for me?"
Steve Johnson.
Yes.
He did the original Slimer.
Steve sculpted the original Slimer, and now he's making these little 6-inch tall Slimers that he's gonna have at Monsterpalooza. It's Son of Monsterpalooza.
Right,
Yes.
which is happening, I think, this month.
Yes.
So what we wanted to use this opportunity to is show the casting process, because this is a little different than the solid, opaque, hard resin casts we've done before.
Yeah.
They're translucent.
Well, we've talked about having translucent castings when we paint our model kits. You kind of like having that little bit of translucency, but this is kind of almost like an extra degree because Slimer's a ghost, and so he's really translucent.
Right, and you also don't want to, when it's super translucent, you can see bubbles, so you don't want bubbles.
Yeah, so we're going to do some translucent casting and try and get it bubble free.
So because this is a mold you didn't make, when someone brings you a mold, whether it's a dump mold or a matrix mold, what are the things you look at when you want to cast something like this?
Well, you have to look at how the piece is oriented in it. Whenever you're making a mold for anything, you have to think about how it's going to be cast and then how it's oriented when you make the mold, like which way you need to tip it, if it's going to catch bubbles somewhere, or if you need to pop vents in it somewhere. There's all kinds of things. And then also how it opens and closes, where those seam lines are going to be, and how do you keep it closed.
Now, because the sculpture's already gone in the mold making process, do you then do a first test pour and then pop it out and you see where there could have been holes, where the things need to get rotated around?
Yep, exactly.
Very cool. So for this process, what's the material you're casting?
So we're going to use Smooth Cast 325, which is just like kind of a clear-ish resin, and then we're going to add some pigment to it. But we're also going to add some glow-in-the-dark pigment, so that once it's charged up in the light, turn your lights off at the end of the night, you still have a glowing Slimer.
I assume it's going to be green?
Yes.
Of course, has to be green. And also to get rid of the bubbles, you're going to use a pressure pot.
Yes, there's a lot of safety things to think about when you're using a pressure tank. You're basically filling a steel container with a bunch of pressurized air, and that can be dangerous. So there's things to think about in that.
How much pressure do you need to get rid of bubbles for a casting of this size?
I have my tanks set around, I think they're around 50 PSI. The difference between 30 to 50 PSI isn't that great of a benefit in bubble popping.
Does that change depending on how big the casting needs to be?
Yeah, size of the casting, how much work time you have. There's all kinds of things to take into consideration, but we really don't need to go super high on PSI. Once that air pressure pops those little bubbles or compresses the air to make the bubbles smaller, it's only going to go so far.
Right, work time is something you mentioned. I know it looks like the resin you have here has a work time of
2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes is really short, so you really want to get that into the tank almost as soon as possible.
Yeah, you have to find that balance between work time and demold time. So if I have a resin that has a 7 or 8 minute work time, I might have an hour demold time, and so I can only run a piece once an hour. This stuff has a 10-minute demold, so I can get one out about every 12 minutes or so.
And if you're casting to make these limited run garage kits, it makes a lot more sense to find that balance between your work time.
And then, life of the mold. If you start using faster resins like this, it's going to burn out the mold a little bit faster. If you use a slower resin, it doesn't build up that exotherm, so your mold won't break down as fast.
Okay, so enough talking. Let's actually get to the casting process.
Cool.
So you have your smooth on buckets. You have it all weighed out. You've done a couple of these before already, so it's a pretty known process.
Yeah, a couple of the guys in my shop have been running these things for a few days, so they have little notes for me on how much we're using.
Very cool. Okay, so what's step one for this casting process?
Step one is we have to put some spray release in the mold to try and make it last a little bit longer and tape it up so that it doesn't leak out all over the cuts in it. So the way this mold is keyed up, it's got this weird zigzag, which makes it kind of hard to kind of wiggle it into place. And see how it folds over on itself. So I don't really like the way this isn't the way I would have done it, but it'll be fine.
And then I noticed when you did your mold release, were you worried about full coverage, or there's certain parts you want to get in there, or just get a general?
This stuff's so highly atomized, you just give it a couple of spritz and it'll get some release in there and it'll be good enough. Yeah, so this is a tape. This is packing tape with strings in it, so it doesn't really stretch a lot. And so that's something that I think about when I'm taping these things up. If I put electrical tape that stretches a lot, it's going to be able to deform and stretch out this mold. But
the walls are also pretty thick here. Do you have to take into consideration where, which part of the mold will get the most warping potentially?
Well, it's not I'm not really worried about warping. I just don't, when I tape up the mold, I don't want to put so much pressure that it deforms the inside. If you squeeze it too much, it'll blow out that seam. If you squeeze it too little, the seam won't close all the way. So
it's just about kind natural resting position.
Exactly.
Okay, you got your part B into the bucket, and now it's time to tint. How much tinting are you putting in?
Tiny, tiny, tiny little bit. You want to sneak up on pigment. It's better to kind of sneak up on the pigment than to kind of go crazy.
And because this is a roughly 1-to-1 mixture, are you looking for twice as dense in the color? Because you'll know you'll be putting another half of clear?
Correct. Yeah, you have to kind of, you can pigment both sides to get a better idea, or once you know what you're doing, you can pigment a whole, container of B side if you're going to make a lot of these things. But yeah, whatever I'm pigmenting this, it's going to be roughly half of that intensity in the final.
And now for something new, glow in the dark.
Glow in the dark. So this glow in the dark pigment, it's called glowworm. It's a powder.
Oh. Wow.
So it disperses in the resin pretty good, and so it'll be pretty neat.
So it doesn't actually change the color. Does it change the opacity at all?
It'll add a little bit of opacity and a little bit of color shift, but nothing too crazy.
Now, because it is a powder, you can control that pretty carefully. Is there a good weight distribution? Are there formulas or how much you want to put in?
There are formulas, but we started out just putting about a half of one of these cups of it in there, and that was good. So what I got to do next is I'm going to mix this A component into here and then quickly pour some in here, only about halfway up. And then I'm going to tip it and kind of jiggle it around to hopefully pop those bubbles that are in the tongue and in the hands and stuff like that, and on the elbows. Then get it into the pressure tank, fill it the rest of the way, and then get the pressure on it.
Frank, you weren't kidding. You had to move pretty quickly there.
Yeah, it's already getting pretty thick.
Oh, wow.
So you can kind of see that it's pretty much there. But you got to let it sit in the tank until it's all the way cured. About 10 minutes. We'll give it like maybe 15.
All right, so while we wait for the 15 minutes, you actually had a chance to speak with Steve about the sculpting.
We have Steve right here.
About the Slimer and, of course, the original Slimer. So let's go check that out.
Steve, this is awesome.
Thank you.
On our podcast that you came on, you read the chapter telling how you sculpted Slimer.
I did.
And in your book, Rubberhead, it's like an amazing story about this. Now, sculpting this little guy, did this bring up any of those same feelings, or?
It did. First of all, can I say how excited I am to be on this show? I watch it all the time. I enjoy it and I learn from it. But, it didn't, because Slimer, there have been so many Slimers. I mean, it's a Christmas decoration, it's a refrigerator magnet, it's a chewy fruit candy, it's everything, right? And then remember that Slimer from Ghostbuster 1 looks incredibly different from Ghostbusters 2. Mm-hmm. So it can kind of be anything. I was contracted to make a Slimer mask recently, and by a client, and that kind of solved a problem, because they would send me a picture of Slimer from Ghostbusters 1, and I'd go, great, since I sculpted it, that's what it looks like, I'll do that. But then they'd go, well, no, we don't want it to look like that, we want it to look like this. And they just send him with a different expression. Because the way we made this in the first movie is that it was just this big floppy piece of rubber. It didn't have cable-activated mechanisms. Typically, smile, you pull it back an inch. This one had a guy's hands back there, so the whole head would, so it's just a bit, it looks different every time. So, but basically what I did is I took my archives and I just matched it from Ghostbusters 1, and no, if you've read the book, it was nothing like the process of Ghostbusters 1. Those days are over.
So, if you were going to try and redo Slimer today, let's say that they were going to make Ghostbusters 50, what would you do different? Like knowing all the technology, all the materials, all the crazy things that people do now?
Of course, we'd create it digitally, 100%. What are you, insane? No, I actually thought about that, because when the reboot came out, I just couldn't help myself from thinking, how cool would it be to take some of the things that we've learned in the past 35 years and do it for this? And because, it was done not in a traditional way. Even back when we made the first one, like I said, it was this big sprung-wired, loose, floppy device that a guy wore with a bunch of people muscling his expressions by hand. But we could do it so much cooler now with the materials we have. And what I was thinking is on Where the Wild Things Are, when we were prototyping that, a gentleman named Billy Bryan, who played the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, came up with this amazing technique, which was air-filled bladder muscle groups. So we could then put a lot of air if we wanted them to be pretty stiff or pretty non-mobile, but if we wanted a huge character, 12-foot character, to sit down, we would release the air to the thighs, butts, and the lower back. And it moved and jiggled so well that to do muscle groups like this and then do some kind of very
giant air bladders,
super elasticized silicone skin, but it would just move like a bowl of jelly. It'd be very cool.
That's cool.
So if one day's looking, Ghostbusters 3.
Yeah, Ghostbusters 3. Steve's got the
Give me a
ideas.
call.
Okay, Frank, time to demold.
Yeah, the stuff's still a tiny bit soft, but it's good enough to get out.
Oh. I see Slimer butt. There you go. Wow, it is warm.
It's very hot. There you go.
Oh.
Yeah, I got a little bubble on the end of the tongue there. So that's the kind of stuff that I was talking about, that it's kind of tricky. It's got a big overhang in there, so when this is upside down in there, the air wants to catch a little bubble there. So that's what I was trying to get rid of, but...
That's why you pour in half first.
Yeah, and then kind of shake it around. But, I mean, all in all, it's not that bad. And if I wanted to, I can probably mix up a tiny little bit of this.
Patch it up?
Patch it up.
That is really cool. I mean, first of all, this is really hot, and that's because this is a fast-working, fast-curing...
Builds up a lot of exotherm.
Exotherm resin. Looking up close, you can't see any of the bubbles on the surface at all. Are you happy with this amount of translucency, this amount of
I think
tinting?
it's great, yeah. I think it'll be really cool.
That's really neat. So what you and Steve are going to do, drill a hole in the bottom on
We're
these.
going to put an LED strip in there, a 5-volt LED strip, and then that mixed with it being glow in the dark, it'll be a pretty fun little thing.
Well, thanks for walking me through the process. It's really interesting learning about tinting, using the pressure tank, and also working with molds that you didn't necessarily make, how you would experiment with castings to make sure you're going to cast up things properly in the future.
Now, had I made this mold on my own, I might not have put the slit in the back. I may have done this a 2-part mold, and then I may have put a vent in the tip of this tongue that came down, and so every casting that will come out, I'd have to pull that little extra material off.
Better have a little sprue there than to have an empty
it's
space.
easier to take an X-Acto and just cut a little nub off than to have a bubble.
All right, well, these are Slimers that Steve's going to have at Son of Monsterpalooza, which is in Burbank in September, and we'll hope to see you there.